All right, we are coming up on 8 o'clock. So, let's settle in, get comfortable, try and keep warm. It's a challenge around here. And let's see where the night will take us. Welcome back. This is our continued holiday season reading, where tonight we will be approaching a classic of the season that surprisingly hasn't been brought up yet. We talked about it last time, and it did take a little bit of searching and hunting to find it. But tonight we will be starting our reading of Nutcracker and Mouse King. Now, do take note, that is an awkward little bit of title. There's no thes, there's no, traditional feelings of, grammatical particles and things like that. No, just Nutcracker and Mouse King. And I wouldn't have it any other way. This is the original, translated into English. It was a German fairy tale to begin with. By E.T.A. Hoffman, and has been the inspiration for so many different medias, whether it be retellings of this story, extensions of this story, adaptations in various media. Cartoons are prolific, or the world-renowned, probably top 3 most famous ballets. Yeah, exactly. This is a one of the top 3 most famous ballets, I'd imagine. The Nutcracker Suite. And yes, Dumas had a retelling of this work. But we're going straight from the tap on this one. Alright, so let's see how this shapes up. There's a lot of fairy tales and folk tales are charming, to say the very least. And this one is both charming and seasonal. So I couldn't think of any better time to read it than just a week or so, a week and a half or so before Christmas. So, here we are tonight, beginning Nutcracker and Mouse King. Christmas Eve. For the entire 24th of December, the children of Medical Officer Stahlbaum were not permitted to step inside the intermediary room, much less the magnificent showcase next door. Fritz and Marie sat huddled together in a corner of the back room. The deep evening dusk had set in, and the children felt quite eerie because, as was usual on this day, no light had been brought in. Fritz quite secretly whispered to his younger sister, she had just turned 7, that he had heard a rustling and murmuring and soft throbbing in the locked rooms since early that morning. Also, not so long ago, Fritz went on, a short, dark man with a large casket under his arm had stolen across the vestibule. However, said Fritz, he knew quite well that it was none other than Godfather Drosselmeyer. Marie joyfully clapped her little hands and exclaimed, "Ah, I wonder what lovely presents he's made for us." Supreme Court Justice Drosselmeyer was anything but handsome. He was short and scrawny, his face was covered with wrinkles, and he wore a big black patch instead of a right eye. He had no hair on his head, which is why he sported a very lovely periwig, made of spun glass and very artistic. Indeed, the Godfather was altogether a very artistic man, who even knew a thing or two about clocks, and could actually build them. So, if any of the beautiful clocks in Stahlbaum's home fell ill and couldn't sing, Godfather Drosselmeyer would come by, remove his glass periwig, take off his snug yellow vest, tie on a blue apron, and insert sharp instruments into the gears. It was very painful for little Marie, but it didn't harm the clock at all. In fact, the clock even grew lively. And it started cheerfully humming and striking and singing again, much to everyone's delight. whenever Drosselmeyer visited them, he would bring something nice for the children. His pocket might contain a mannequin that could twist its eyes and bow, which was comical to see. Or Drosselmeyer might have a box from which a little bird came hopping out. Or he might have something utterly different. But for Christmas, Drosselmeyer always completed a gorgeous, artistic work, which cost him a great effort. That is why, after showing the gift, the parents would very cautiously stored it away. "Ah, I wonder what lovely presents he'd made for us," Marie exclaimed. Fritz decided that this year it could be nothing but a fortress, where all kinds of very handsome soldiers drilled and marched to and fro. Next, other soldiers would have to storm and invade the fortress. But now the inside soldiers boldly shot their cannons, making them boom and burst. "No, no," Marie interrupted Fritz. "Godfather Drosselmeyer told me about a beautiful park, with a huge lake, and with marvelous swans gliding about and wearing gold neckbands, and singing the loveliest songs. Then a little girl comes to the lake and entices the swans, and feeds them sweet marzipan." "Swans don't eat marzipan," Fritz broke in quite roughly. "And Godfather Drosselmeyer couldn't make a whole park. Actually, we get little out of his toys. They're promptly taken away from us. So I much prefer what Mama and Papa gave us. We can keep their presents nicely and do whatever we like with them." Now, the children debated what their parents would bring them. Marie felt that Fraulein Trutchen, her large doll, was changing deeply. For clumsier than ever, she fell on the floor every moment. This didn't happen without a nasty grin, and there were no further thought of the cleanliness of her garments. Nor did a thorough scolding help. Also, Mama, we are told, smiled with such delight at Gretchen's small parasol. Fritz, by contrast, assured the others that his royal stable lacked a good sorrel, just as his troops fully lacked a cavalry. Papa was well aware of that. So the children knew that their parents had bought them all kinds of beautiful presents, which they now displayed. But the children were also certain that the dear Holy Christ shone upon them with the pious and friendly eyes of children. And they were equally convinced that, as if touched by fruitful hands, every Christmas gift would bring marvelous pleasure like no other. The children, who kept whispering about the expected presents, were reminded of that pleasure by their older sister, Louise. And they added that it was now also the Holy Christ, who, through the hands of their dear parents, always gave them whatever real joy and pleasure he could bring them. Indeed, he knew that a lot better than did the children themselves, who didn't have to nurture all sorts of hopes and wishes. Rather, they had to wait, still and pious, for their Christmas presents. Little Marie grew pensive, while Fritz murmured to himself, "I'd love to have a sorrel and hussars." By now it had grown completely dark. Fritz and Marie, thoroughly pressed together, did not dare say another word. It sounded as if rustling wings encircled them, and as if they could catch a very distant and very splendid music. A bright shine grazed the wall, and now the children knew that the Christ child had flown away on radiant clouds, flown to other happy children. At that moment they heard a bright silvery chime, cling-ling, cling-ling. The doors burst open, and the radiance erupting into the large room was so deep that the children cried out, "Ah!" and they halted on the threshold, petrified. But then Mama and Papa stepped in, took the children by the hand, and said, come on, you dear children, and look what the Holy Christ has brought you." This brings us to the next chapter, part, segment. Not really numbers, it's just names here, but the gifts. I turn to you, gentle reader or listener, Fritz, Theodore, Ernst, or whatever your name may be, and I picture you vividly at your last Christmas table, which is richly adorned with gorgeous multicolored presents. You will then envisage how the children halted, in silence and with shining eyes. You will then envision how, after a while, Marie called out with a deep sigh, "Ah, how beautiful! Ah, how beautiful!" And Fritz turned out his capriolas, which were very successful. But the children had to have been devout and well-behaved the entire year, for never had they had such splendid and such beautiful gifts as this time. The huge fir tree in the center carried many gold and silver apples, and like buds and blossoms, the sugared almonds and colorful bonbons and goodness knows what other tidbits emerged from all the branches. However, the loveliest and most praiseworthy feature of the Wonder Tree was the myriad of tiny lights that twinkled like tiny stars in its dark boughs. And the tree itself, shining in and out, warmly invited the children to pick its blooms and fruits. Around the tree, everything shone very grand and bright. Gorgeous things there were. Why, who could describe them all? Marie saw the most delicate dolls, all kinds of small, clean implements, and, what was loveliest of you, a silk frock, daintily garnished with party-colored ribbons, hung from a rack right in front of Marie, so she could observe the dress from all sides. And that is what she did, while exclaiming over and over, "Oh, the darling little frock! Oh, the lovely little frock! And I'll be quite confident that I'll be allowed to wear it." Meanwhile, Fritz, trotting and galloping around the table 3 or 4 times, was testing the new sorrel, which he had indeed found on the table, fenced in. Climbing back down, Fritz thought that the sorrel was a wild beast, but it didn't matter. Fritz would certainly overcome it, and he mustered the new squadrons of hussars, who were magnificently garbed in red and gold and carried silver weapons. The horses they were riding were so shiny white, you might have almost believed that they were pure silver too. The children, a bit calmer now, wanted to pounce on the picture books, which were lying open, so you could see all sorts of very lovely blossoms and gaudy people and delightful children playing. And they were all painted so naturally, as if they could truly live and speak. Yes, indeed. The children were about to pounce on these wonderful books when the doorbell rang again. Knowing that now Godfather Drosselmeyer would offer his gifts, the children ran over to the table, which was standing alongside the wall. The screen that had hidden the table for such a long time was quickly removed, and what did the children witness? On a green lawn, embellished with colorful flowers, stood a fabulous castle, with many plate-glass windows and golden turrets. A glockenspiel resounded, doors and windows opened, and you could see very tiny but dainty ladies and gentlemen in plumed hats, and with long trains strolling through the chambers. The middle room had so many burning candles and silver chandeliers that it looked as if it were fully ablaze, and children in short vests and jerkins were dancing to the sound of the glockenspiel. A gentleman in an emerald cape often peered through the window, beckoned to the onlookers, and disappeared again, just as Godfather Drosselmeyer himself, but scarcely larger than Papa's thumb. At times stood below at the castle gates, then stepped back inside again. With elbows propped on the table, Fritz looked at the beautiful castle and the strolling and dancing figurines. Then he said, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, let me into your castle." Drosselmeyer indicated that this was out of the question, and he was right, for it was foolish of Fritz to wish to enter a castle that, together with its golden turrets, was not as tall as Fritz himself. And Fritz understood. After a time, when the ladies and gentlemen were strolling to and fro in the same fashion, the children were dancing, the Emerald Man was peering out the same window, and Godfather Drosselmeyer stationed himself at the gates. Fritz asked impatiently, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, why don't you come out through the other door over there?" "That won't do, dear little Fritz," Drosselmeyer replied. "Well, then, let him go," Fritz went on. "Let the Green Man go strolling with the others. After all, he keeps peering out." "That won't do either," Drosselmeyer again replied. "Then tell the children to come down," cried Fritz. "I want to investigate them more closely." Oh, none of this will really do, said Drosselmeyer, annoyed. The mechanics are set up, and that's how they must stay. Really? Fritz drawled. None of this will do? Listen, Godfather Drosselmeyer, if those small polished things in the castle can only keep repeating themselves, then they're not worth much, and I don't especially have to call for them. I need to praise my hussars. They have to maneuver forward and backward whenever I wish, and they're not locked in any house. And with that, Fritz jumped out toward the Christmas table, and he had his squadron leap back and forth on his silver horses, trotting and wheeling and smashing and firing to his heart's content. Marie had likewise stolen away so gently, for she too had gotten fed up with the dancing and meandering of the tiny dolls in the castle. Though well-behaved and well brought up as she was, she didn't voice her annoyance, as did Brother Fritz. Drosselmeyer spoke rather crossly to the parents. Such artistic work is not meant for senseless children. I'm simply going to pack up my castle. However, the mother came over and had the godfather explain the inner construction, and the very wonderful and very creative gear unit, which set teensy dolls moving. The counselor took everything apart, and then put it together again. While laboring, he turned cheerful again, and he gave the children a few lovely tan men and women with golden hands, legs, and faces. They were made entirely out of the fanciest gingerbread, and they were so sweet and pleasant as to greatly delight Fritz and Mary. Sister Louise, and, as Mother wished, had put on the lovely frock that was one of her gifts, and she looked gorgeous. However, when she was likewise about to don her dress, Marie felt that she would rather see it on Louise for a bit, and her mother was glad to comply. So far we have a very normal but very charming Christmas morning from a very German perspective. The idea of Christmas tables and the Christ child being the deliverer of gifts is a very different perspective. Different time, different cultures, and all that. And it's a fun reminder that the holidays are different in all sorts of households. All over the place. Yes, hello, Zoe. Yeah, yeah. Listening out who could possibly be listening was incredibly German-coded. Alright, the protege. Actually, Marie didn't want to leave the Christmas table, for she had discovered something that no one else had as yet noticed. You see, the review of Fritz's hussars, who had paraded closely past the tree, had revealed an excellent little man who stood there, quiet and modest, as if calmly awaiting his turn. Granted, there was a lot to object to in his stature, for aside from the fact that his somewhat lengthy and powerful upper body didn't quite fit in with the tiny, skinny legs, his head likewise seemed much too big. To a great extent, amends were made by his attractive clothes, which suggested a man of taste and breeding. After all, he sported a very lovely, shiny violet dolman, with countless white braids and buttons. He also wore the loveliest trousers, and the finest ankle boots that had ever graced the feet of a student, much less an officer. These boots were as snug on the delicate little legs as if they were a perfect fit. Now, it was funny that he had donned a miner's cap, and that he had accompanied his garb in black with a slim, clumsy cape that looked like wood. Meanwhile, Marie felt that Godfather Drosselmeyer had also slung an awful morning coat around his shoulders and put on a dreadful cap. But he was still a very dear godfather. Marie had likewise mused that no matter how delicate the little man, the godfather would never be as appealing as he. The little girl had instantly liked the nice man, and the more she looked at him, the more she realized what a gentle and kindly face he had. The light green, bulging eyes promised nothing but friendship and benevolence. It was good for the man to place a well-groomed, white cotton beard on his chin, since you could perceive the sweet smile of the deep red lips all the more clearly. "Ah!" Marie finally exclaimed. "Ah, dear father, who owns that darling little man over on the tree over there?" "He," the father answered, He, dear child, should work hard for all of us. He should crack the hard nuts for us nicely, and he should bring to Louise as much as he should belong to Louise as much as he belongs to you and to Fritz. The father then removed him cautiously from the table, and raising the wooden cake aloft, the mannequin opened his mouth wide, wide, and showed 2 rows of very sharp, very shiny white teeth. When told to do so, Marie inserted a nut and crack, crack, he chewed up the nut, so that the shell dropped away and the sweet kernel itself ended up in Marie's hand. By now everyone, including Marie, had to know that the dainty little man was an offspring of the dynasty of Nutcrackers, and was practicing his profession. She shouted for joy, but then her father spoke. "Since, dear Marie, you love friend Nutcracker so much, you must shield and shelter him especially, even despite the fact that, as I have said, Louise and Fritz have as much right to use him as you." Marie promptly took Nutcracker in her arms, and had him crack nuts, though she picked the smallest ones. That way the mannequin wouldn't have to open his mouth very wide, which basically didn't look so good. Louise joined Marie, and the friend Nutcracker also had to perform his duties for Louise, which he didn't seem to mind doing, since he smiled very amiably all the time. Fritz, meanwhile, had grown tired from all the riding and drilling, and when he heard the pleasurable cracking of nuts, he sprang over to his sisters and roared with laughter at the quaint mannequin. Now that Fritz also wanted to eat nuts, the little man passed from hand to hand, unable to halt his snapping open and shut. Fritz kept shoving in the biggest and hardest nuts. All at once, they heard a double crack. Then 3 little teeth fell out of the Nutcracker's mouth, and his whole lower jaw turned loose and wobbly. "Oh, my poor dear Nutcracker," Marie exclaimed, whisking him out of Fritz's hand. "He's a stupid, simple-minded guy," said Fritz. "He wants to be a Nutcracker, but he has no decent teeth. He probably doesn't understand his own work. Hand him over, Marie. He has to chew up nuts for me, even if he loses his remaining teeth, even his entire jaw in the bargain. Who cares about that good-for-nothing?" Little brothers, huh? I guess big brothers in this case for Marie. "No, no!" Marie wept. "You're not going to get him, my dear Nutcracker. Just look at the way he watches me so sorrowfully, and shows me his little injured mouth. But you're a cold-hearted person, Fritz. You beat your horses, and you even let a soldier be shot dead." "That's the way it has to be. You just don't understand," cried Fritz. "Anyway, Nutcracker belongs to me as much as he belongs to you. Hand him over." Marie began sobbing hard, and she quickly wrapped up the sick Nutcracker in her tiny handkerchief. The parents came over with Godfather Drosselmeyer, who, to Marie's great regret, sided with Fritz. However, her father said, "I deliberately placed Nutcracker under Marie's protection, and now that I see she needs him, she has full power over Nutcracker, with no interference from anyone. Incidentally, I'm very surprised that Fritz demands further services from somebody who has been injured in service. After all, as a good military man, he should know that wounded soldiers never line up in rank and file." Fritz was very ashamed, and, without concerning himself any further about nuts and about Nutcracker, he stole over to the other side of the table. There, after setting the appropriate outposts, the Tsars had gone to their night quarters. As for Marie, she hunted down Nutcracker's little lost teeth. Around his wounded chin she had wrapped a lovely white ribbon, which she had detached from her frock and bound up. The poor little man had looked very pale and frightened, and so Marie had wrapped him more gingerly than before in her cloth, cradling him in her arms like a baby. She looked at the lovely pictures in the new picture book, which lay out today among all the other gifts. Contrary to her usual behavior, Marie got quite angry when Godfather Drosselmeyer kept laughing and asking how she managed to remain so lovely despite that thoroughly hideous mannequin. Now she recalled the bizarre comparison she had drawn with Drosselmeyer at first sight, and she spoke very earnestly. "Who knows, dear Godfather? If you were spruced up like my dear Nutcracker, and if you had on such lovely, shiny ankle boots, who knows if you wouldn't be as beautiful as he?" Ooh, out of the mouths of babes. Marie couldn't tell why her parents laughed so loudly, why Supreme Court Counselor developed a red nose and didn't laugh as clearly as before. It must have been a special reason. All right. Now for the next part. Marvels. So we've seen the introduction of most of the important characters. At least the one of the titular characters anyway. And we'll see what marvels we have in store here. When you step through the door into the home of the medical counselor, you'll find a tall glass cabinet on the broad wall to your left. The shelves store all the lovely presents that are given to the children every year. Louise was still very little when her father ordered the cabinet from a very skillful cabinet maker. The man inserted the panes so brightly. Indeed, he knew how to equip the entire showcase so adroitly that everything inside looked almost shinier and lovelier than if you were holding it yourself. There's something very charming about a good curio cabinet. The top shelf, unattainable for Marie and Fritz, held Drosselmeyer's artworks. Right below was the shelf for the picture books. The two lowest shelves could be filled by Marie and Fritz however they wished, but usually Marie assigned the bottom shelf for her dolls to live on, while the shelf overhead, Fritz drove his troops into the cantonments. The same thing had happened today. While Fritz had stationed his hussars overhead, Marie had put Fraulein Trutchen aside, had placed the new and spruced-up doll in the very elegantly appointed room, and had invited herself to some delicious confectionery with Marie. The room was appointed very elegantly. So I've said, and it's also true, for I don't know you, but my attentive reader, Marie, like little Miss Stahlbaum, you already know that she too is called Marie. I wonder if the little girl has a small, lovely, flowery sofa like this Marie. Do they have several darling little chairs, a dainty tea table, and above all, a little spick-and-span bed, where the prettiest dolls rest? All these things were in the corner of the cabinet, whose walls were papered here and there with little party-colored pictures. And you can imagine that the new doll, who, as Marie learned that same evening, was named Fraulein Clarkchen, had to feel very wonderful in this room. It was late evening. Indeed, midnight was approaching, and Drosselmeyer had long since gone home. However, Marie and Fritz still couldn't leave the glass cabinet, no matter how much their mother kept ordering them to finally get to bed. "It's true!" Fritz exclaimed at last. "Those poor guys," he meant his hussars, "they want to have their rest too, and so long as I'm here, no one dares to catch 40 winks. I already know that." Fritz left, but Marie begged and begged. "Just a wee bit longer, please, dear mother. Let me stay just a wee bit longer. I have to take care of a few things. When I'm done, I'll go straight to bed." The very urgent tasks of children. Marie was a devout and reasonable child, and so her good mother had no qualms about leaving her alone with her toys. Still, her mother wanted to keep Marie from being all too deeply tempted by the new doll and the lovely playthings. Forgetting about the candles burning all around the wall closet, the mother snuffed all of them, so that only the lamp suspended in the middle of the ceiling spread a gentle, graceful light. "Come in soon, dear Marie. Otherwise you won't get up at the right time tomorrow," exclaimed the mother, withdrawing into the bedroom. As soon as Marie was alone, she quickly went over to do what was quite properly on her mind, and what she could not tell her mother, though she did not know why. Marie still had the wounded Nutcracker wrapped in her handkerchief, and she carried him in her arms. Now, she placed him cautiously on the table, unwrapped him softly, and tended to the injuries. Nutcracker was very pale, but he beamed so ruefully and amiably that his smile shot right through her heart. "Oh, dear little Nutcracker," she murmured very softly. please don't be angry at me because my brother Fritz hurt you so deeply. He didn't really mean it so badly. He'd just gotten a bit hard-hearted in the wild military. Otherwise, he's a truly fine boy. You can count on it. But now, I want to nurse you very tenderly until you're fully sound and cheery again. As for reinserting your little teeth thoroughly and properly and straightening out your shoulders, Godfather Drosselmeyer can take care of all of that. He's an expert in such matters. However, Marie could not finish. For when she pronounced Drosselmeyer's name, friend Nutcracker's face twisted up devilishly, and his eyes virtually emitted sparkling green prickles. But the moment Marie tried to get properly released, she was again viewed by that mournfully smiling face of honest Nutcracker. And now, she knew that it was the draft and the quickly blazing ray of the lamp that had totally distorted his features. Aren't I a silly little girl, scared so easily that I can even believe this little wooden doll can make faces? Still, I care so much for Nutcracker because he's so funny, and yet so kind, and that's why he has to be nursed as is proper. Marie now took friend Nutcracker by the arm, went over to the glass cabinet, huddled in front of it, and spoke to the new doll. Please, pretty please, Fraulein Clarton, please give up my little bed for sick, wounded Nutcracker, and make do with the sofa as best you can. Don't forget that you're very healthy and powerful. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such thick, dark red cheeks. And don't forget that very few of the most gorgeous dolls own such soft touches. In her full, shiny Christmas garb, Fraulein Clarton looked very noble and very angry, and she didn't breathe a word. Now, why am I making such a fuss? Said Marie. She pulled out the bed and tucked dear Nutcracker in very gently and delicately, and wrapped him up with a beautiful little ribbon. She normally wrapped the ribbon around her body. However, this time she wrapped it around his injured shoulders and covered him all the way up to her nose. But he mustn't remain with naughty Clarton, Marie went on. She pulled up the little bed together with Nutcracker, who was lying on it, and she placed them on the top shelf. In this way, the little bed lay right next to the lovely village where Fritz's hussars were billeted. Marie locked the cabinet and was about to go into the bedroom when, now, listen children, when she caught a soft, soft whispering and murmuring and rustling all around. Behind the oven, behind the chairs, behind the cabinets. The wall clock hummed louder and louder, but it wouldn't strike. Marie looked up. The big, gilded owl perched on the clock had lowered its wings, covering the whole timepiece and poking forth the ugly cobblestone with the hooked nose. And the noises grew louder, and words could be made out. Tick-tock, clock, tick-tock. And everyone has to hum softly, hum softly. After all, Mouse King has a fine ear. Hum, hum, hum. Strike, chime, do, soon there will be few. And the humming resounded dull and hoarse 12 times. Marie shuddered dreadfully, and she would almost have dashed off in horror if she had not spotted Godfather Drosselmeyer, who sat on the wall clock in lieu of the owl, his yellow coat-tails dangling like wings on both sides. However, Marie pulled herself together, and she exclaimed loudly and tearfully, Godfather Drosselmeyer! Godfather Drosselmeyer! What are you doing up there? Come down and stop frightening me, you nasty godfather! However, now wild giggling and whistling started all around, and virtually 1,000 little feet were trotting and scurrying behind the walls, and virtually 1,000 little candle stubs were flickering through the cracks in the floorboards. Still, these weren't candle stubs, no! These were tiny, sparkling eyes, and Marie realized that mice were peering out and preparing themselves everywhere. Soon, the room reverberated with trot, trot, hop, hop. Brighter and denser squads of mice were galloping to and fro, and they finally lined up in rank and file, the way Fritz stationed his soldiers before a battle. Marie found this very funny, and unlike some other children, she didn't have a natural aversion to mice. Indeed, she was about to shed any terror she might have felt, when all at once, the room began to whistle so sharply and so outrageously that she had to shudder. What did she notice now? No. Truly, my honored reader Fritz, I know that your heart is in the right place, just like the heart of the wise and bold General Fritz Stahlbaum. But if you had seen what Marie saw now, you would have truly dashed away. I even feel that you would have leaped into bed and pulled the cover much farther over your ears than necessary. Ah, poor Marie could not do even that. For just listen, children. Right at her feet, as if driven by subterranean force, the ground spurted out sand and lime and crumbling wall stones, and 7 mouse heads with 7 brightly sparkling crowns loomed high from the ground, hissing and whistling quite unbearably. Soon the mouse body, to whose neck the 7 heads were attached, likewise worked his way out completely, and the large mouse, adorned with 7 diadems, exulted in its full chorus. Squeaking loudly 3 times, the mouse faced the entire army, which suddenly got moving. Hot, 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 trot. It headed straight toward the cabinet. Ah! Straight toward Marie, who was standing right up against the glass door. Marie's heart had beaten so loudly in fear and terror that she thought it might burst out from her chest, and she would then have to die. But now she felt as if the blood were frozen in her veins. Half fainting, she staggered backward, hearing klr, klr, purr, purr, and the glass pane of the cabinet, elbowed by Marie, collapsed in fragments. At that moment, Marie did feel a truly sharp pain in her left arm, but her heart suddenly felt much lighter. She heard now no squeaking or piping. Everything was very still, and even though she didn't care to have a look, she did believe that the mice, frightened by the tinkling of the glass shards, had retreated to their own holes. But just what was that? Right behind Marie, strange noises were now heard from the cabinet, and very fine voices resounded. "Wake up! Wake up to the battle this very night! Wake up to the battle!" And harmonious chimes jingled sweetly and gracefully. "Ah, that's my little glockenspiel," cried Marie, jumping aside. Now she saw a bizarre lighting in the cabinet, a puttering and fiddling around. There were several dolls, hurrying and scurrying about, and fighting with their skinny arms. All at once, Nutcracker sat up, flung the cover away, and leaped out of bed with both feet, shouting, "Crack, crack, crack! Foolish mice pack! Crick, cracked, real sack!" And with that, Nutcracker drew his little sword and waved it in the air and cried, "You, my dear friends and vassals and brothers, do you wish to help me in the hard struggle?" 3 Scaramouches promptly retorted, as did 1 Pantaloon, 4 Chimney Sweeps, 2 Zitherists, and 1 Drummer. "Yes, sir, we submit to you in steadfast devotion, and we march with you into death, struggle, and victory." And they followed the passionate Nutcracker, who dared to make the perilous leap from the top shelf. It was no use their jumping, for not only did they wear rich garments of cloth and silk, but there wasn't much more inside of them than chaff and cotton. That was why they plopped down like sacks of wool. Poor Nutcracker would certainly have broken his arms and legs, for just imagine, it was nearly 2 feet high above the shelf, and where he was standing, until the bottom. And his body was as brittle and as if carved out of linden wood. Yes, indeed, Nutcracker would have certainly broken his arms and his legs if, in the moment of his leap, Fraulein Klarchen had not also jumped from the sofa and caught the hero's drawn sword in her soft arms. "Oh, you dear, sweet Klarchen," Marie sobbed. "How I misunderstood you. You would have certainly been glad to give up your little bed to friend Nutcracker." But now Fraulein Klarchen spoke, pressing the young hero gently against her silken breast. "If you do not wish, O Lord, sick and wounded, as you are, to join the struggle and the peril, then see how your courageous vassals, belligerent and certain of victory, gather together. Scaramouche, Pantaloon, Chimney Sweep, Zitherist, and Drummer are already downstairs, and the coat of arms figures on my shelf actually throb and thump noticeably. You may wish, sir, to rest in my arms, or watch your victory from my plumed hat." Those were Clarkson's words, but Nutcracker was so very unruly, and he kicked so hard that Clarkson had to drop him on the floor. However, at that instant, Nutcracker knelt down politely on one knee and whispered, "Oh, my lady, I will remember you in charm and grace while I tussle and struggle." Clarkson bent down so deep that she was able to clutch Nutcracker's skinny arm as she gently pulled him up. Then she quickly detached herself with her multi-spangled girdle, and she was about to hang it around Fritz's neck, but Fritz stepped back 2 paces, put his hand on his chest, and spoke very solemnly. "Do not, oh my lady, wish to waste your grace on me," he faltered, took a deep breath, and then he tore the ribbon from Marie's shoulders. He pressed the ribbon against his lips. Fritz now hung the ribbon around his waist like an officer's sash, and then, boldly swinging his naked sword quickly and nimbly, he sprang like a tiny bird across the ridge of the floor. You must notice, very gentle and excellent readers, that when Nutcracker had come alive, he had quite clearly felt all the love and kindness that Marie had shown him. It was only because he had become so good, or she had become so good, that Fritz did not even want to accept and wear Fraulein's ribbon, although it shone brightly and looked very lovely. Good, loyal Nutcracker preferred getting all spruced up with Marie's simple little ribbon. Now, what comes next? When Nutcracker springs down, the squealing and squeaking likewise resume. Ah! The obnoxious crews of countless mice stay under the big table, and the horrible mouse with the 7 heads looms over all of them. What is next? I don't actually know how long this is. We're getting into a lot of the actual, the traditional story here. So, I'm gonna have to look up real quick, as we're between chapters, how long the Nutcracker is. Okay, so it's like anywhere between 60 and 120 pages, I guess. It doesn't really say what the original was. Yeah, I think it's somewhere between a short story and a novella. So, probably it's anywhere from a 1 to 2 day read. We'll see how it goes. The ballet itself is about 2 hours long, but... Alright, so... the next chapter that we have is The Battle. "Beat to the general march, my loyal vassal Drummer!" Nutcracker yelled. Drummer instantly rolled the drums so artistically that the panes of the glass cabinet shivered and shuddered. The interior cracked and clabbered, and Marie realized something about the covers of all the boxes in which Fritz's army was billeted. The covers violently jumped up, and the soldiers leaped out and down in the bottom shelf, where they collected in glossy teams. Nutcracker scurried to and fro, speaking enthusiastic words to the troops. "No dog of a trumpeter stirs and shifts," Nutcracker shrieked angrily. Then he quickly turned to Pantaloon, who grew somewhat pale, his nose wobbling and wobbling. Nutcracker spoke solemnly. "General, I am aware of your courage and your experience. The goals here are a rapid survey and a use of the moment. I entrust you with the command of all the cavalries and artilleries. You don't need a horse, you've got very long legs, and you can gallop quite decently. Now, carry out your vocation." Pantaloon immediately squeezed his long, dry fingers against his mouth, and he crowed so piercingly that it sounded like 100 bright trumpets blowing cheerfully away. A neighboring stamping now emerged in the cabinet, and lo and behold, Fritz's cuirassiers and dragoons, and especially the shiny new hussars, marched out and soon halted down below on the floor. Now, regiment upon regiment defiled past Nutcracker with flying colors, and fife and drum, and presented itself in rank and file across the floor of the room. However, Fritz's cannons then rolled up, clanking and surrounded by the cannoneers, and soon the cannons went boom, boom, and Marie saw the sugar peas smash into the thick pile of mice that were covered with white powder, and were very ashamed. Above all, however, they suffered great damage by a heavy battery, which had rolled up on Mama's footstool, and boom, 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 and shot gingerbreads in succession, and under the mice, which made them drop. But then the mice came nearer and nearer, and they even overran a few cannons, which sounded purr, 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 and in the smoke and dust, Marie could scarcely see what was happening. Yet, so much was certain. Every corps fought with supreme vehemence, and for a long time victory swung back and forth. The mice kept developing more and more masses, and their tiny silvery pills, which they hurled very cleverly, were now striking the interior of the glass cabinet. Clarchen and Trutchen desperately scurried about, wringing their little hands sore. "Should I die in the flower of my youth? I, the loveliest of dolls?" cried Clarchen. "Have I preserved myself so well as to perish here inside my four walls?" cried Trutchen. They flung their arms around each other, and they bawled so dreadfully that you could hear them despite the huge racket. For, gentle reader, you barely have an inkling of the uproar that now began. Purr, purr, poop, poop, pit, tan-tara, 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 boom, 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 all tangled up. And Mouse King and mice squealed and shrieked, and they again heard Nutcracker's tremendous voice issuing useful orders, and they watched Nutcracker as he marched over the battalions standing in the line of fire. Pantaloon launched a few brilliant cavalry attacks and covered himself with glory. But Fritz's hussars were pelted by the mouse artillery with ugly, smelly bullets, which left nasty stains on their red jerkins, and that is why they didn't care to go ahead. Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting onomatopoeias here. Furthermore, Pantaloon ordered them to wheel to the left, and in the enthusiasm of commanding, he did likewise, and so did his dragoons and cuirassiers, that is. They all wheeled to the left, and went home. In so doing, the battery perching on the footstool was endangered, and it wasn't very long before a dense squad of very hideous mice charged so heavily that the entire footstool toppled over together with cannons and cannoneers. Nutcracker, who seemed very dazed, ordered the right wing to retreat. You know, oh my experienced listener Fritz, that a retreat is almost the same as a flight. And you already joined me in mourning because of the misfortune that afflicted the army of the little Marie, as loved by Nutcracker. Sorry, there's a little bit of background noise here. They're plowing up the driveways, and hopefully it's not coming through too much. A bit of a droning on my end. But avert your eyes from this disaster, and view the left wing of Nutcracker's army, where everything is still good, and much is to be expected from the general and the army. During the most heated fighting, quiet masses of mouse cavaliers had come debouching out from under the dresser, and amid noisy, gruesome squealing, they had thrown themselves on the left wing of Nutcracker's army. But what resistance they encountered? Slowly, as the difficulties of the terrain allowed, they had to pass the ridge of the cabinet. The corps bearing the coat of arms had advanced under the leadership of 2 Chinese emperors, and had formed itself en plain. These brave, splendid, and colorful troops, which consisted of many gardeners, Tyroleans, Tunguses, barbers, harlequins, cupids, lions, tigers, apes, and long-tailed monkeys, fought with great courage, deep composure, and tough endurance. This battalion of elitists, showing Spartan boldness, would have torn victory from the foe, if a daring enemy horse captain had not recklessly plunged forward and bitten off the head of one Chinese emperor, who, in falling, would have then killed 2 Tunguses and a long-tailed monkey. The result was a hole through which the enemy pushed in, and soon the entire battalion was chewed up. However, the enemy had little profit from this atrocity. Just as a bloodthirsty mouse cavalierist chewed up a bold opponent straight to the middle, the mouse was given a small printed slip of paper down his throat, from which he promptly died. But did this help Nutcracker's army, which, having begun its retreat, now drew farther and farther, losing more and more men, so that unfortunate Nutcracker was left with just a tiny squad right in front of the glass cabinet? "The reserves, step forward! Pantaloon, Scaramouche, Drummer, where are you?" Nutcracker was hollering, hoping for fresh troops, which were to be deployed out of the glass cabinet. Indeed, a few brown men and women actually emerged with gingerbreads, golden faces, hats, and helmets in advance. But they fought so clumsily that they struck none of the enemies, and soon they would have even knocked Commander Nutcracker's cap off his head. The enemy chasseurs also bit off their legs, so that they toppled over, killing a few of Nutcracker's comrades in arms. Nutcracker was now densely surrounded by the enemy. In the highest fear and distress, he wanted to jump across the cabinet bridge, but his legs were too short. Clarchen and Trutchen lay there unconscious. They couldn't help. Hussars and dragoons sprang merrily past him and into the fray. He now yelled in utter despair, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At that instant, 2 enemy tirailleurs grabbed him by his wooden cape, and triumphantly squealing out of 7 throats, Mouse King came leaping up. Marie could no longer contain herself. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker! My poor Nutcracker!" she sobbed, snatching her left shoe, and, not quite aware of what she was doing, she flung her shoe into the thickest squad of mice. At their king! In that moment, everything seemed to fade and waft away. But Marie felt an even sharper pain in her left arm, sharper than before, and she fainted dead to the world. Even the Mouse King needs to fear Le Troncle. All right. So we've seen the battle. And Marie faded into unconsciousness. And now we have the illness. When Marie awoke, as if from a deathly coma, she found herself in her little bed. The sun shone, twinkling and sparkling through the icy windows into the room. Right next to Marie sat a stranger, whom she soon recognized as the surgeon, Dr. Wendelstern. He murmured softly, "She's awake." Now her mother came over and scrutinized her anxiously. "Ah, dear mother," whispered little Marie, "are all the ugly mice now gone, and is good Nutcracker saved?" "Don't talk such nonsense, dear Marie," her mother replied. "What do the mice have to do with Nutcracker? But you naughty child, you've caused us so much worry and anguish. That's what happens when children are willful and disobey their parents. Yesterday, you played with your dolls until late at night. You grew drowsy, and perhaps you were startled by a protruding mouse, which is unusually not found in this area. In any case, you shoved your arm into a pane of the glass cabinet. The cut was so deep that Dr. Wendelstern, who removed the glass fragments from the wounds, felt that if the glass had sliced an artery, you would have retained a stiff arm or even bled to death. Thank goodness that when I awoke at midnight and missed you so late, I got up and stepped into the living room. You were lying unconscious on the floor right next to the glass cabinet, bleeding torrents. I was so scared that I nearly blacked out myself. There you lay, and scattered all round you were many of Fritz's lead soldiers and other dolls, shattered coats of arms and gingerbread men. Nutcracker, however, lay on your bleeding arm, and not far from here lay your left shoe." "Oh, Mama, darling," Marie broke in, "just look. Those were the traces of the great clash between the dolls and the mice. And that's why I was startled. When the mice wanted to capture poor Nutcracker, who was in command of the army of dolls, I hurled my shoe at the mice. But I don't know what happened next." Dr. Wendelstern winked at the mother, who spoke very gently to Marie. "Let it be, my dear child. Calm down. The mice are all gone, and Nutcracker is standing in the glass cabinet, healthy and cheery." Now, the medical officer came into the room, and he had a long talk with Dr. Wendelstern. Next, the medical officer felt Marie's pulse, and she heard something about a wound fever. Marie had to stay in bed and take medicine, and she did so for several days, even though she didn't feel sick or uneasy aside from some pains in her arm. She knew that Nutcracker had escaped the battle safe and sound, and at times she felt as if she were dreaming that he spoke to her quite lucidly, though mournfully. "Marie, dearest lady, I already owe you a great deal, but you can do even more for me." She pondered and wondered, but it was no use. She couldn't figure out what Nutcracker meant. The girl couldn't play at all because of her injured arm, and if she wanted to read or to leaf through one of the picture books, her head swam and she was forced to stop looking. Time must now have been inching along very slowly, and Marie could hardly wait until twilight, when Mother would sit at her bedside and read a lot to her or tell her lovely stories. Mother had just finished the wonderful tale of Prince Facardin when the door opened, and Godfather Drosselmeyer walked in, saying, "Now I really have to see the sick and wounded girl for myself." The instant Marie spotted Godfather Drosselmeyer in his yellow jacket, she so vividly recalled the night when Nutcracker lost the battle with the mice. Now, she involuntarily exclaimed to her godfather, "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you were quite ugly. I saw you perching on the clock and muffling it with your wings, to keep it from striking loudly. Otherwise, the mice would have been swept away. I heard what you shouted at Mouse King. Why didn't you help Nutcracker? Why didn't you help me, you ugly Godfather Drosselmeyer? Isn't it all your fault that I have to lie in bed sick and injured?" The mother, quite terrified, asked, "What's wrong with you, dear Marie?" But Drosselmeyer was making very bizarre faces, and he spoke in a snarling and monotonous voice. "Pendulum had to hum, didn't wish to fit. Clocks, clocks, clock, pendulum had to hum. Softly hum, bells boom, bells blast. Limp and lame and honk, tall girl. Don't worry, scurry, ring the bell. Bell is rung, bell is sung. To drive away Mouse King today. Now the owl comes flying fast. Pack and pick and pack. Pick and pack, chimes are jingly, clocks hum, hum, pendulums have to hum. Pick wouldn't stick, hum and purr and purr." Marie gaped at Godfather Drosselmeyer because he looked very different, and far uglier than usual, and because he kept swinging his right arm as if it were a marionette. She would have been truly horrified at the godfather if the mother hadn't been present, and if Fritz, having sneaked in, hadn't finally interrupted the godfather by laughing very hard. "Oh my, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you're much too funny again today. You're gesticulating like my jumping jack, who I tossed behind the stove long ago." The mother remained very earnest, and said, "Dear Herr Godfather, this is quite a strange joke. What are you aiming at?" "Heavens!" retorted the Drosselmeyer, laughing. "Have you forgotten my charming clockmaker ditty? I'll always sing it for patients like Marie." Yes, very charming indeed. Now he settled at her bedside, saying, "Now, just don't be angry that I didn't hack out all of the Mouse King's 14 eyes for you. But I couldn't have managed. Instead, I'll do something delightful for you." Drosselmeyer reached into his pocket, and what he now softly produced was Nutcracker. The godfather had skillfully and solidly reinserted Nutcracker's lost teeth and straightened out his jaw. Marie was utterly overjoyed, and Mother said, smiling, "Now, do you see that Godfather Drosselmeyer means you no harm with your Nutcracker?" "But Marie," the godfather broke in, "you must admit that Nutcracker doesn't actually have a great physique, and that his face cannot exactly be called handsome. If you like, I can tell you how such ugliness came into his family, and was handed down. Or do you happen to know the story of Princess Perlipat, Mousering Switch, and the artistic clockmaker? Now listen, Fritz unexpectedly interrupted. Listen, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you inserted the teeth correctly in Nutcracker's mouth, and his jaw is no longer so wobbly. But why is he lacking a sword? Why didn't you give him a sword? Oh my, Drosselmeyer retorted quite indignantly. Why must you be grumpy and grouchy about everything, boy? What do I care about Nutcracker's sword? I healed his body. Let him obtain a sword as he likes. You're right, cried Fritz. He's a capable guy. He'll know where to find weapons. Well, Marie, the Godfather went on, do you know the tale of Princess Perlipat? No, I don't, Marie replied. Tell us, dear Godfather, tell us. I hope, said the mother, I hope, dear Godfather, that your story won't be as gruesome as the stories you normally tell. By no means, answered Drosselmeyer. Quite the contrary. What I have the honor of reciting is quite humorous. Tell us, oh tell us, Godfather, cried the children. And Drosselmeyer began. Well, he will begin as soon as we come back from a short break, because I would like to top up my coffee and stretch my legs. So, we'll be back in just a few minutes, where we will continue the Nutcracker and Mouse King from the next chapter, The Tale of the Hard Nut. All right, we are back. All right, I did a little looking ahead, and we are actually we're not quite at about the halfway mark. There's quite a lot to this, actually, and this edition, actually, the one that I'm reading from, has the original German, and then immediately thereafter, not the original German, but the original version translated from German, and immediately after has the Dumas retelling. I did not know this one had both. This was actually a pretty good find. So, we'll just be reading this one, obviously. It would be quite silly to do both one after the other. But that does present options for another time, another day, another year. Maybe we'll pick up the Dumas version next Christmas. We'll see. Alright, so let's continue on as Godfather Drosselmeyer tells the story of Princess Pirlipat and how the Nutcracker found himself to be less than blessed with good looks in his bloodline. The Tale of the Hard Nut. Yes, behave, behave. Pirlipat's mother was a king's wife, hence a queen, and in the moment of her birth, Pirlipat herself was a born princess. The king was beside himself for joy over his beautiful little daughter lying in the cradle. He exulted loudly, he danced and pranced on one leg, and he kept hollering, "Hooray! Has anybody ever seen anybody more beautiful?" All the ministers, generals, presidents, magistrates, and staff officers hopped on one leg just like the sovereign and shouted, "No, never!" Indeed, there was no denying that no more beautiful child than Princess Pirlipat had been born since the dawn of time. Her little face was virtually woven out of lily white and rosy red silk flakes. Her little eyes were of vivid sparkling azure. Her curls twisted in a head full of shiny gold threads. In addition, Pirlipat brought 2 rows of small pearly teeth into the world. And 2 hours later, when the Grand Chancellor tried to examine her facial lineaments more closely, she bit his finger so hard that he shrieked, "Oh, Jiminy!" Then again, others claimed that he yelled, "Ow!" Others are sharply divided, even today. In any case, she really did bite the Chancellor's finger. And now the delighted populace knew that intellect and intelligence dwelt inside Pirlipat's little body, which was as delightful as that of an angel. Everybody was delighted. Only the Queen was very anxious and nervous. No one knew why. What especially struck people was that she had the cradle guarded very carefully. Aside from the Tremonts, who occupied every threshold, and aside from the pairs of ladies-in-waiting, who had to sit close to the cradle, 6 other ladies were scattered around the room, night by night. However, what seemed quite foolish and unfathomable was that each of these 6 ladies-in-waiting had to take a tomcat in her lap and stroke him all night long, compelling him to ruminate constantly. It would be impossible, dear children, for you to guess why Pirlipat's mother made all these arrangements. But I know why, and I will tell you now. It happened that many very enchanting princes and marvelous kings had once gathered at the court of Pirlipat's father, which is why the entire court shone gleefully, and why countless plays, balls, and tournaments were put on. To show he didn't lack for gold and silver, the king wanted to thrust his hand properly into the royal treasury and lavish a decent amount. Having been secretly informed by the Supreme Royal Kitchen Master that the court astronomer had scheduled the slaughter of pigs, the king ordered a huge sausage feast. Then he jumped into the carriage and personally invited all the kings and princes himself, purely for a spoonful of soup, to enjoy the surprise of the magnificent delight. Now, the king spoke very amiably to the queen. "You know, my darling, how much I love sausages." The queen knew what the king was driving at. He meant simply that she ought to submit to the very useful business of making sausages, as she herself had done in the past. The supreme treasurer had to promptly deliver the huge golden sausage cauldron and the silver casseroles to the kitchen. They lit a big sandalwood fire, the queen tied on her damask kitchen apron, and soon the sweet fragrances of the sausage soup were steaming out of the cauldron. The pungent aroma wafted all the way to the Privy Council. The king, imbued with pleasure, couldn't help himself. "With your permission, gentlemen," he shouted. He then flew into the kitchen, embraced the queen, stirred the soup with his golden scepter, and, calming down, he returned to the Privy Council. This is a very interesting kingdom. They had reached the important point when the bacon was to be sliced into cubes and roasted on silver grills. The ladies in waiting left the kitchen because the queen wished to perform this action herself out of loyalty, fidelity, and devotion to the royal consort. However, when the bacon started to roast, they heard a very fine whispering. "Give me a little roast bacon too, sister. I want a piece too. After all, I'm a queen too. Give me a bit of the roast bacon." The queen knew that Frau Mauserink was speaking. For many years now, she had been living in the royal palace. She claimed that she was related to the royal family, and that she herself was a queen in the land of Mausolia. And that was why she presided over a large court underneath the hearth. The queen was a good and charitable woman. If she didn't wish to recognize Frau Mauserink as a queen and as her sister, then she could at least grant her, from the bottom of her heart, the banqueting on festive days. The queen exclaimed, "Come right out, Frau Mauserink. You can enjoy my bacon in any event." Frau Mauserink scurried over, hopping merrily. She leaped up to the hearth, and her delicate little paws took hold of each bit of bacon offered her by the queen. Now, all of Frau Mauserink's male and female relatives came springing up, as did her 7 sons. These sons were ill-bred boors. They overwhelmed the bacon, and the terrified queen couldn't fend them off. Luckily, the royal controller's wife came running up. She drove away the intrusive guests, managing to leave some bacon, which, following the assessment of the royal mathematician, was distributed very skillfully among all the sausages. With drums beating and trumpets blasting, all the visiting princes and potentates, clad in splendid holiday garb, drew past, heading toward the sausage feast, whereby some of the guests were mounted on white amblers and some rode in crystal coaches. The king welcomed them with hearty friendship and benevolence. Then, as sovereign, with his crown and his scepter, he sat down at the head of the table. In the liverwurst station, people could see that the king was turning paler and paler, gazing at the heavens. Gentle moans fled his breast. A tremendous pain seemed to be burrowing through his insides. Then, in the blood sausage station, so loudly groaning and groaning, weeping and wailing, he sank back in his armchair, with both hands over his face. All the diners sprang up from the table, and the royal physician tried in vain to check the royal pulse. The king seemed to be ripped apart by a profound and nameless yowling. Finally, after much coaxing, after the application of strong medicines more than there were scorched quills, and so forth, the king seemed to have recovered somewhat. He barely stammered the words, "Too little bacon!" The queen now pathetically threw herself at his feet and cried out, "Oh, my poor miserable royal consort! Oh, what pains you have suffered! But now you see the culprit is at your feet. Punish her hard! Oh, Frau Mauserink, with her 7 sons, and with all her male and female relatives, has gobbled up the bacon, and..." But now the queen fell back in a dead faint. king furiously leaped up and yelled, "Royal Controller's wife! How did that happen?" The Controller's wife reported whatever she knew, and the king resolved to get even with Frau Mauserink and her family for gobbling away the bacon from the sausages. The Privy Council assembled, and it decided to put Frau Mauserink on trial and to confiscate all her goods. However, the king pointed out that she could, after all, still gobble up the bacon during the procedure. So, the entire matter was handed over to the royal clockmaker and the royal adept. This man, who had the same name as I, namely Christian alias Drosselmeyer, promised, through a very special, politically shrewd operation, to drive Frau Mauserink and her family out of the palace forever and ever. Drosselmeyer actually invented very tiny, very skillful devices, in which roast bacon was applied to minuscule threads that Drosselmeyer set up around the home of Frau Bacon Gobbler. Frau Mauserink was far too wise not to catch Drosselmeyer cunning. But none of her warnings, none of her notions could help. Lured by the sweet fragments of the roast bacon, all of Frau Mauserink's 7 sons and many, many male and female relatives stepped into Drosselmeyer's devices. And just as they were about to nibble away the bacon, they were trapped by suddenly dropping gate and then shamefully executed right in the kitchen. With her tiny squad, Frau Mauserink abandoned the site of terror. Grief, despair, and revenge imbued her breast. The court rejoiced heartily, but the queen was worried, for she was well acquainted with Frau Mauserink's mentality, and she knew that Frau Mauserink would not leave the deaths of her sons and relatives unavenged. And indeed, Frau Mauserink did appear just as the queen was preparing a long puree for the royal consort, a treat he especially liked. And Frau Mauserink said, "My sons, my relatives have been killed. Be careful, your little royal highness. Make sure that Mouse Queen doesn't chew the little princess in half. Make sure." Thereupon she vanished again, and was seen no more. But the queen was so terrified that she dropped the lung puree into the fire, and so Frau Mauserink spoiled a second royal treat, which infuriated the king. But that's enough for Fritzemarie tonight. The rest will be taken care of tomorrow. Marie had her own thoughts in regard to the story, and much as she asked Godfather Drosselmeyer to keep going, she didn't wait to be persuaded. Instead, she jumped up. "Too much of a good thing is unhealthy. We'll hear the final part of the story tomorrow." Just as the counselor was about to step out the front door, Fritz asked, "Do tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it really true that you invented the mousetrap?" "How can you ask such a silly question?" the mother cried. But the godfather smiled inscrutably and murmured, "Am I not enough of a skillful clockmaker, and not even enough to invent mousetraps?" That whole story was just the right level of ridiculous. It's someone telling a kid a story and just making it up as they go the entire way, and it was glorious. Had to catch myself a couple times through that, but it was fun. Very, very fun. Alright, let's continue with the continuation of the tale of the hard nut. "Now, you know very well, children," Drosselmeyer continued the next evening, "you know very well why the queen had the gorgeous Princess Perlipat guarded so carefully. Shouldn't the queen fear that Frau Mauserink might carry out her threats, come back and chew the little princess to death? Drosselmeyer's devices were useless against Frau Mauserink's wisdom and insight, and only the royal astronomer, who also doubled as the king's secret diviner and stargazer, appeared to know that only the family of Tomcat Purr would be able to keep Frau Mouserink away from the cradle of the princess. Hence it happened that each lady-in-waiting held one of the sons of that family in her lap, deftly stroking him, trying to sweeten his vast political service. Incidentally, the sons were employed at court as secret legation councils. One midnight, one of the two ladies sitting close to the cradle awoke out of a deep sleep. Everybody around them lay there, trapped by slumber, no purring, a deep, deathly hush, in which the picking of the woodworm could be heard. But how did the secret supreme lady-in-waiting feel when she spotted a huge, hideous mouse, which stood up on its hind legs, pressing its wretched face against the head of the princess? With a shriek of dismay, the lady jumped up. Everybody awoke. That same moment, Frau Mouserink, nobody else was the big mouse on Pirlipat's cradle, scurried into a corner of the room. The legation councils dashed after her, but too late. Frau Mouserink vanished through a crack in the floor. Pirlipat was awakened by the uproar, and she wept very lamentably. "Thank goodness," the ladies exclaimed. "She's alive!" But how great was their horror when they looked for Pirlipat and saw what had become of the lovely, delicate child. Instead of her golden locks with a white and red face and an angelic head, a thick, deformed head now perched on a twisted, teensy-weensy body. The small azure eyes had turned into green, gaping, gawking eyes, and the little lips had pulled from one ear to the other. The queen dissolved in weeping and wailing, and the royal study had to be thoroughly padded because time after time the king would run with his head against the wall, shouting lamentably, "Oh, what a miserable monarch I am!" The king realized perfectly well that it would have been better to eat the sausages without bacon and leave Frau Mouserink and her clan in peace behind the hearth. But Pirlipat's royal father wouldn't hear of it. Instead, he placed all the blame on the royal clockmaker and adept, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg. That was why the king issued a wise order. Drosselmeyer had 4 weeks to restore Princess Pirlipat to her former condition, or at least indicate a specific unerring measure for doing so. Otherwise, the royal clockmaker would be doomed to a shameful death under the headsman's axe. Drosselmeyer was not without fear, but he relied on his skill and his luck, and he promptly tackled the first operation that struck him as useful. He took Princess Pirlipat apart very adroitly, unscrewed her little hands and feet, and viewed her inner structure. But alas, he found that the bigger the princess grew, the more shapeless she became, and he was at a loss, at his wit's end. He very carefully put her together again, and sank into a melancholy at her cradle, which he was not allowed to leave. The 4th week had already begun. It was Wednesday when the king peered into the cradle, his eyes sparkling furiously. Brandishing his scepter, the king exclaimed, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess, or you must die!" Drosselmeyer started weeping bitterly, but the princess delightfully cracked nuts. For the first time, Drosselmeyer noticed that Pirlipat had been born with teeth, and that she had an unusual appetite for nuts. Indeed, she had hollered so long after her transformation until a nut happened to come her way. She promptly cracked it open, ate the kernel, and then calmed down. Since then, the ladies couldn't bring her enough nuts. "Oh, holy instinct of nature, eternally inscrutable sympathy of all beings," cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. "You show me the gates to the mystery. I wish to knock, and the gates will open." Drosselmeyer then asked for permission to speak to the court astronomer, and he was taken to him under a heavy guard. These two gentlemen embraced tearfully because they were close friends. Next, they withdrew into a secret study, where they perused many books dealing with instincts, sympathies, antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night broke in. The court astronomer gazed at the stars, and, with the help of the very dexterous Drosselmeyer, he cast the princess's horoscope. This demanded great effort, for the lines got more and more entangled. But finally, what joy! Finally, it lay clearly before them that the princess, in order to undo the hideous spell and restore her beauty, had nothing to do but enjoy the sweet Crackatuck nut. The shell of the Crackatuck nut was so hard that a 48-pound cannon could have charged across it without breaking it. But this hard nut had to be chewed up in front of the princess by a man who had never shaved and who had never worn boots. And with closed eyes, he handed the princess the kernel. The young man could reopen his eyes only after taking 7 steps backward without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer labored uninterruptedly for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, the king was having his Saturday dinner. All at once, Drosselmeyer, who was to be decapitated on Sunday at the crack of dawn, burst in joyfully and ecstatically, and he announced the measure for restoring the princess's lost beauty. The king hugged Drosselmeyer with intense benevolence and promised him a diamond sword, 4 medals, and 2 new Sunday coats. After we finish our meal, the king added amiably, we can get to work right away. Make sure, dear adept, that the young, unshaven, and non-booted man with the Crackatuck nut is properly at hand. He should drink no wine earlier, otherwise he'll stumble when he tries taking 7 steps backward like a crab. Afterward, he can lick her up for all he's worth. Drosselmeyer was stunned by the king's words, and it was not without shaking the shuddering that he managed to squeeze out a response. He had discovered the measure. Now, both the Crackatuck nut and the young man had to be sought, but it remained doubtful whether Nut and Nutcracker could ever be found. The fuming sovereign swung his scepter over his crowned head, and he roared in a lion's voice, "Then we'll make do with your heads!" Lucky for Drosselmeyer, who was filled with terror and misery, the king had found his meal to be delicious that very day, so he was in the right mood to listen to reasonable ideas, of which the magnanimous queen had no lack. Indeed, she was deeply touched by Drosselmeyer's fate. Drosselmeyer pulled himself together and finally pointed out that he had gained his life by actually carrying out the king's orders. And he had been told to find the means of curing the princess, and he had done so. The king called these lame excuses a silly twaddle, but eventually, after drinking a glass of digestive, he decided that both the clockmaker and the astronomer should get going and should not return without a Crackatuck nut in their pocket. The man who bit them open should, as the queen informed them, insert multiple public notices and various advertisements in domestic and foreign gazettes. Drosselmeyer broke off here, and he promised to finish the story tomorrow evening. Yeah, it does. It does feel about right for royals. Just every bit as absurd as you can imagine. Alright, next we have the conclusion of the tale of the hard nut. No sooner were the lights on the following evening than Godfather Drosselmeyer actually showed up and continued the story. He's having fun with this, I'm sure. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been roaming for 15 years already without catching even a hint of the Crackatuck nut. Now, I could spend 4 whole weeks telling you, dear children, where they had been and what strange things they had encountered, but I won't report on those matters. I'll merely say that in his deep sorrow, Drosselmeyer eventually felt deeply homesick for his hometown of Nuremberg. This yearning swept over him especially one day when he and his friend happened to be in a vast Asian forest, smoking pipes filled with cheap tobacco. Oh, beautiful, beautiful hometown of Nuremberg. Beautiful town. If a person hasn't seen you, even though he may have traveled a lot to London, Paris, Petrovaradin, then his heart cannot have stirred. He must long for you always. Long for you, oh Nuremberg. Beautiful town with its beautiful houses and windows. When Drosselmeyer lamented so dolefully, the astronomer was filled with profound commiseration, and he started to bawl so deplorably that his weeping and wailing could be heard all over Asia. But then he pulled himself together and wiped the tears from his eyes, and asked, "Worthy colleague, why do we sit here and blubber? Why don't we go to Nuremberg? Does it really matter where and how we seek the wretched Crackatuck nut?" "That's true," Drosselmeyer replied in comfort. The two men stood up, knocked the tobacco from their pipes, and headed straight out of the Asian forest toward Nuremberg. No sooner had they arrived than Drosselmeyer hurried over to visit his cousin, the doll-maker, lacquerer and gilder, Christoph Zacharias Drosselmeyer, whom he hadn't seen for many, many years. The clockmaker told his cousin the entire story about Princess Pirlipat, Frau Mouserink, and the Crackatuck nut. Time and again the cousin threw his hands together and cried out in amazement, "Oh, cousin, cousin! What wonderful, wondrous things these are!" Drosselmeyer kept talking about his adventures on his vast travels. He spent 2 years with the Date King, who had been disdainfully rejected by the Almond Prince, and had inquired in vain at the Nature Society in Eichhornshausen. In short, the clockmaker had failed everywhere to find even a trace of the Crackatuck nut. During this account, Christoph Zacharias had often snapped his fingers, whirled about on one foot, clicked his tongue, and cried out, oh, the devil take it. Finally, he threw his cap and his wig into the air and hugged and squeezed the cousin. Cousin, you are safe and you are sound, I tell you, for everything and everyone must be deceiving me if I don't own the Crackatuck nut myself." He then produced a box, from which he drew a gilt nut of medium size. "Look," he said, showing the nut to his cousin. "Look! Let me tell you about this nut. Many Christmases ago, a stranger came here, peddling a sack of nuts. Unfortunately, he got into a fight with the local nut dealer right outside my doll's cottage. So he put down his sack in order to defend himself more easily. The residents attacked the stranger because he couldn't stand having the outsider hawk nuts. At that moment, a heavily loaded truck rolled over the sack, crushing all the nuts but one, which the stranger, with a bizarre smile, offered me for a shiny 20-penny piece from the year 1720. This struck me as wonderful. Now, I happened to have such a coin in my pocket. I bought the nut and gilded it, not quite knowing why I paid so much and why I now held the nut in such high esteem. The very specific coin. 20-penny piece from the year 1720. This was definitely the Crackatuck nut that they had been hunting. Any doubts were dispelled when they summoned the astronomer, and he scraped the gilt cleanly off with the coin. Under the gilt, they found the word Crackatuck engraved in Chinese characters. Convenient. The travelers were ecstatic, and the cousin was the happiest man under the sun when Drosselmeyer assured him that his fortune was made. Aside from a considerable pension, he would receive for free all gold for gilding. Both the adept and the astronomer had already put on their nightcaps and were about to hop into bed when the astronomer began. "My dear colleague, all good things come in pairs. We have found not only the Crackatuck nut, but also the young man who bites her open and hands the beauty of the kernel to the princess. I mean, nobody other than your own cousin's son. No, I don't want to sleep. I want to cast the boy's horoscope tonight." Next, the astronomer tore the nightcap off the boy's head and began to observe the stars. The boy was actually nice and well-built, and he had never shaved, and he had never worn boots. Granted, in his early youth he had been a jumping jack for about 2 weeks, but now there wasn't even the slightest inkling of that time. for he had been educated through his father's efforts. During the Yule season, he wore a lovely gold-trimmed red coat and sword. He kept his hat under his arm, and he sported an excellent hairstyle and a bagwig. Now, he stood glowing in his father's chamber, and, out of native gallantry, he cracked the nuts for the young girls, which is why they'd nicknamed him Dear Little Nutcracker. The next morning, the ecstatic astronomer threw his arms around the adept and shouted, "He's the one! We've got him! We've found him! But there are two things, dearest colleague, that we mustn't ignore. First of all, you have to braid your wonderful nephew a robust wooden cue, which is linked so closely to the lower jaw that the latter can be pulled strongly. Now, when we arrive at the residence, we must cautiously hide the fact that we have brought along the young man who bites open the Crackatuck nut. Quite the contrary, he has to turn up a great deal later than we. According to the horoscope, several men have gnashed up a few teeth unsuccessfully, and so the king has promised that the suitor who chews up the nut and restores Perlipat's beauty will be rewarded with the hand of the princess, and with the right of succession to the throne." The dollmaker cousin was quite satisfied that his boy should marry the Princess Perlipat and become prince and king, so he left him fully to the envoy. The cue that Drosselmeyer braided for his young, hopeful nephew was so admirable that he put on the most brilliant experiments by chewing up the hardest peach pits. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer promptly informed the authorities of their discovery of the Crackatuck nut, whereby the necessary arrangements were made on the spot. And when the travelers arrived with the cosmetic preparation, many attractive people, including even a few princes, had already appeared, relying on their healthy teeth. They wanted to break the spell cast on the princess. The envoys were horrified when they saw the princess. The tiny body with its teensy hands and feet could barely carry the shapeless head. The ugliness of the face was increased by a white cotton beard around the mouth and the chin. Now, everything occurred just as the court astronomer had read in the horoscope. Clad in shoes, one young shaver after another bit himself sore on the Crackatuck's teeth and jowls without helping the princess in the least. Dentists had been summoned, and when an unfortunate suitor was being carried away half unconscious, he would sigh, "That was a hard nut to crack." Now, when the king, in the terror of his heart, promised his daughter and his kingdom to the suitor who would cast off the magic spell, the gentle cousin stepped forward and asked permission to start the process. Oh, hang on, we're dropping some frames. Hang tight. We've had a pretty good run of reasonably decent connection for a while, so this feels about right to have a bit of a fumble. But I think we're back. I'm not dropping extra frames. Preview looks good. All right. Let's just roll this back to the previous paragraph. Yeah, it's right. It's been pretty stable lately, honestly, so I'll try not to jinx it. We can just say we were owed a little bit of trouble, and it's about time. All right. Oh, hang on, we're dropping again. Okay, and we're back. All right, a little bit up, a little bit of down. All right. Now, when the king, in the terror of his heart, promised the daughter and his kingdom to the suitor who would cast off the magic spell, the gentle cousin stepped forward and asked permission to start the process. Nobody but the young Drosselmeyer appealed so intently to Princess Perlipat. She placed her tiny hands on her heart and sighed quite tenderly. "Ah, if only he'll be the one who bites open the Crackatuck nut and becomes my husband." After young Drosselmeyer very politely bowed to the king and the queen, and also Princess Perlipat, he received the Crack-a-Duck nut from the hands of the supreme master of ceremonies. Taking the nut between his teeth, the boy tugged at his cue, and crack, 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 the shell crumbled into many bits and pieces. Adroitly, the boy cleaned the threads still dangling from the kernel, and handed it over to the princess, while bowing and scraping, whereupon he closed his eyes and began stepping backward. The princess then swallowed the kernel, and, oh wonder, the freak vanished, and instead there stood a woman of angelic beauty. Her face was virtually woven out of silk flakes that were lily white and rosy red. Her eyes were like glowing azure, her full locks curling as if twisting like golden threads. Drums and trumpets joined the loud jubilation of the people. The king with his entire court danced on one leg as they had done at Pirlipat's birth. And the queen had to be revived with eau de cologne because she had fainted in bliss and pleasure. Young Drosselmeyer hadn't even completed his 7 steps when the tumult disrupted his self-composure. But he held out for self-control. He was just sticking out his right foot for his 7th pace when Frau Mouserink, hideously squeaking and squealing, rose out of the floor. As a result, Drosselmeyer, about to set down his own foot, stepped so hard on Frau Mouserink's foot that he stumbled and almost lurched over. Oh, misfortune! In the blink of an eye, the boy became as misshapen as the princess had been. His body was shrunken, and it could barely carry the thick, malformed head with its huge, bulging eyes and its broad, dreadfully yawning maw. Instead of the queue, a narrow wooden cape hung down his back, thereby controlling the lower jaw. The clockmaker and the astronomer were beside themselves with dismay and horror. But then they saw Frau Mouserink bleeding and rolling on the floor. Her evil did not go unavenged, for young Drosselmeyer had struck her throat so roughly with the sharp heel of his shoe that she was doomed to expire. And, in peril of death, she squeaked and squealed lamentably. "Oh, Crack-a-Duck, hard nut, see the death of me! Fine little Nutcracker, soon you too will be dead for all to see. 7 crowns for 7 heads. Mother will pronounce you dead. Nutcracker, fine will be all mine. Oh, life, so fresh and red, I leave you dead. Squeal!" And with that shriek, Frau Mouserink gave up the ghost, and her corpse was carried off by the royal oven heater. Nobody had paid any heed to young Drosselmeyer, but now the princess reminded the king of his promise, and so he immediately sent for the young hero. But when the unhappy boy stepped forward in his deformity, the princess held both hands over her face and yelled, "Away! Away with the wretched Nutcracker!" The Lord Chamberlain grabbed the boy's little shoulders and threw him out the door. The king was furious that they had tried to force a Nutcracker on him as a son-in-law. He blamed everything on the misfortune of the clockmaker and the astronomer, and he barred them from ever stepping foot inside the residence again. None of this was mentioned in the horoscope that the astronomer had cast in Nuremberg, but it didn't prevent him from observing the heavens once more. And indeed, he read a number of things in the stars. He found that young Drosselmeyer would do so well in his new position that he would become prince and king despite his malformation. However, his deformity would vanish only when Frau Mouserink's son, whom she had born after the deaths of her 7 sons with 7 heads, had become Mouse King. That son would have to be felled by his own hand, and a lady would have to fall in love with him despite his defects. Indeed, around Christmas, young Drosselmeyer had supposedly been spotted in his father's chamber in Nuremberg, granted as Nutcracker, yet definitely as prince. That, child, is the tale of the hard nut. And now you know why people are apt to say that was a hard nut to crack. And now you know why nutcrackers are so hideous. And that was how Drosselmeyer concluded his story. Murray felt that Princess Pirlipat was really a loathsome and ungrateful thing. Prince, on the contrary, assured her that if Nutcracker was otherwise a decent sort, he wouldn't beat around the bush with the Mouse King, and he would soon regain his earlier good looks. Alright, and that is the end of that chapter. Now I am going to look ahead a little bit, because we're nearing the end of tonight, but I'm not sure how much more story we have. Alright, there's actually a fair bit. 87, or page 87, and we're on page 69. Yeah, so there's not... we won't be able to get through it tonight, but probably tomorrow we should probably, with this amount left, be able to finish before break time. In which case we can pull out a short story or something and wrap up the day, or just yap again, well, whatever the case may be. So we'll split. We'll probably we'll end our reading here for tonight. Let's see. I can't do a bookmark in this one, can I? No, I can't. But I'll just leave this window open. That'll be good enough. So, this has been the Nutcracker and Mouse King so far. It's been a lot of fun. I know I, for one, never really remember anything that happens after the first battle scene. I know, like, in my head, I know things the story keeps going on, but really, at the first battle scene and when the dolls in the cabinet come to life and they fight the mice, that's about as far as I ever remember. So, it's good to continue the story and get the backstory from the wonderfully creative Godfather Drosselmeyer. That is true. We were children when we last heard it, I'm certain. So, there is that. So, yeah, so you had said earlier that you're a fan of the ballet. I don't know that I've ever actually seen the ballet of this. Largely just for reason of lack of availability. I really should at some point just pull it up on YouTube or something. Never really have been too drawn to that sort of thing, which is a shame, really, because it is a tremendous amount of work and talent that goes into a ballet of any sort. And to have the dance be the primary method of storytelling is a very interesting way to present the story. So I'll definitely need to probably add that to my queue of things to do to keep busy. That's awesome. Yeah, it is always the very coolest when there is a sort of a influential figure to the youth who takes it upon themselves to spread good culture to people that they can reach out to. Whether it be a teacher, a nurse, or parent, or anybody along those lines, to introduce kids and youth to good stuff is awesome. See, yeah, that's... You start the ball rolling and you get a lifetime of satisfaction out of it. Is whether or not you do anything after becoming a theater kid or anything, it cultivates an appreciation. You can watch a musical and enjoy it without having to have your arm twisted into it and all that. That is, yeah, you have to wonder if our influencers would approve of what we've become. Whether it be a punk musician or a VTuber old man reading stories. All right. So, I really like how this story has been played out so far. I know we had mentioned how, like, folk stories and the like can be very charming, and this fits it to a bill. It's very personal and comfortable. It feels like someone telling a story to their kids at night. And, like, that is the absolute best compliment you can pay to a story, is that it just feels natural. It's right. It's got a good flow. It's a conversation, even though it is all ink on a page. I love it. I love that so much. And it's so hard to find good examples of stories like this that are a natural back and forth between audience and author. So, we'll need to remember this one and other things. Oh man, 6, the opera scene in 6 was so good. So good. Honestly, 6 in general was so good. So, pick your influences with care. Alright, guys. So we're a little early tonight, but it's cold out. I'm going to set up the actual fireplace and settle in. Yeah, you're right. It's 6. The scene there was so... It catches the opera perfectly. Gets the story out. It has it's more than just a play with music. And that is what a lot of people misunderstand. So, yeah. Alright, as I was saying, we are wandering off toward the end of the night. It's blusteringly cold here. So I think I'm going to set up by the fireplace tonight with the cats. Yep, exactly. And we're going to have a wonderful night of it tonight. So, I thank you very much for joining us. We will be back tomorrow at our normal time, 8 o'clock Eastern, to continue our reading of The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. And there I am again throwing these into there. It's just a more natural flow, I guess. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow for that. I thank you for joining us tonight. And until next time, have a wonderful evening. Bye.